I have told this story only once before to my court secretary, Orvith Kale, in the immediate aftermath of the event. That telling was private and brief, and I was, by my own admission, not entirely coherent at the time. He informs me that his notes from that session are incomplete. I believe him, because I do not remember most of what I said. My voice was unreliable and my recollection of the sequence was disordered, and I think at one point I described the same exchange twice without noticing. 3 months have now passed. I am composed. You have your pen, historian. I will tell it again. You may write it in the formal account style if you choose. Third person, past tense, the kind of language that looks clean and official and bloodless in the archive. I do not care about the form. What I care about is the accuracy. Every word I give you is true. I have no reason to embellish this story and considerable reason not to, because the thing that happened was embarrassing in the technical sense. I mean that it has caused me to feel embarrassed, in retrospect, for reasons I will get to, and if I were embellishing I would shape it differently. I am not shaping it. I am giving it to you as it was. Because there will be people who read this account in 50 years and assume I have embellished, and I want the record to be clear that I have not. I will begin at the beginning. The Velthorn dynasty has held the outer agricultural ring for 6 generations. The ring itself is not glamorous. It is a collection of orbital platforms, ground installations, relay stations, and processing nodes that together produce approximately 40% of the palace complex's grain and livestock supply. It is, in practical terms, the reason the court does not go hungry, and it is also, in practical terms, the part of the dynastic holdings that the court thinks about least. People think about their food supply when it fails. When it does not fail, it is simply there, as walls are simply there, and they attend to other things. I have attended to it more than most kings of my line, partly because my father was indifferent to it, and I resolved early in my reign to be different, and partly because I find that the parts of governance which produce no ceremony are often the parts that are most worth understanding. The outer ring visits, which my father discontinued in the 14th year of his reign, and which I reinstated in my 3rd year, are not ceremonial in any meaningful sense. There are no processions, no formal audiences, no banquets. There are inspections of growing beds and livestock enclosures and storage facilities, briefings from agricultural technicians, and conversations with platform staff who, because the visits are rare enough to be unusual, are often genuinely uncertain how to behave in the presence of the king, and so simply tell me what they actually think. This, I have found, is invaluable. The Outer Ring Tour runs 11 days each year and covers 7 installations. Outpost Velithkale was added to the schedule this year for the first time. I want that on the record clearly. It was not on the schedule in previous years. I added it. Outpost Velithkale is a Tier 4 agricultural relay station established in the 3rd year of my father's reign. Its function is seed banking for the outer agricultural ring and biological monitoring of a livestock complement that includes calves, breeding ewes, and a small colony of grain-adapted bird stock whose role in the platform's pollination cycle is, apparently, more important than their size would suggest. The platform sits in a fixed orbital position, 8 light towers from the nearest transit node, 11 from the palace, which means in practical terms that if something goes wrong on Velithkale, the response time from the palace is not hours but days. This is a known characteristic of Tier 4 installations. It is accepted. The installations are designed to be self-sufficient precisely because this is the case. The platform staff number 11. 6 agricultural technicians, 2 platform engineers, a records manager, a general maintenance technician, and 1 individual listed in the staffing manifest as medical officer, human contractor, 6-month term, responsible for staff health maintenance and biological monitoring of the platform's livestock complement. That last phrase, biological monitoring of the platform's livestock complement. I read that phrase in the pre-tour briefing, and I understood it to mean that the medical officer handled livestock health as an additional duty. I did not understand it to mean, or rather did not register the full implication of it, that the medical officer was a veterinarian. Her name is Dara San. She is 52 years old. She has 27 years of licensed practice in large animal veterinary medicine, with a secondary certification in agricultural biology. And it is that secondary certification which allows her to serve as a platform medical officer for the human staff of a Tier 4 installation, on the standard understanding. Standard in Tier 4 contracts. I was informed afterward that any serious human illness requiring specialist intervention would be referred to a physician at the nearest transit hub, and the medical officer's role in the meantime would be stabilization and basic care. Stabilization and basic care. I have thought about those words a great deal in the past 3 months. I have thought about what they cover and what they do not cover, and whether the gap between what they promise and what Dara-san actually delivered has any official designation in the administrative vocabulary of the court medical division. It does not. I checked. We arrived at Velith on the afternoon of the tour's third day. My son Sareth was 9 years old at the time and is now, following recent events, 9 years old and 3 months, and fully in possession of his health, his humor, and his determination to tell me facts about grain varieties at mealtimes that I did not specifically ask for. This is a condition I find entirely acceptable. I want it noted that I find it entirely acceptable. He had asked me, some weeks before the tour, where the palace food came from. He had asked it at dinner quietly, in the way he sometimes asks things that matter to him, looking at the table rather than at me, as if the question might be less alarming if he didn't watch me receive it. I told him it came from the outer ring. He asked if we could see the outer ring. I told him we went to see it once a year, and that this year he could come with me. He nodded and went back to eating. He was satisfied. I have always liked that about him. He does not ask for the sake of asking. When he asks something, it is because he wants the answer, and when he gets the answer, he is finished. Velith was the 6th stop on the tour. By the time we arrived, Sareth was accustomed to the rhythm of the inspections, the briefings, the slow walks through growing beds and enclosures, the conversations with staff who were not sure whether to look at me or at the floor and who settled usually for looking at Sareth, because he was a child and therefore less daunting. He was good at the visits. He listened when the technicians explained things, asked the questions that occurred to him, and did not perform either enthusiasm or boredom. He was himself. On the transit to Velith from the previous station, he was quieter than usual. I noticed this. I attributed it to travel fatigue, which is a reasonable attribution at the end of a long tour, and I turned my attention to the briefing notes for the Velith stop. I noticed more clearly at dinner. He ate very little. He had the bright, slightly removed quality in his eyes that I have learned over 9 years of fatherhood to recognize as the early signature of a fever. I touched his forehead. The warmth was already there, building rather than simply present, the warmth of a system beginning to mount a response to something. I said nothing to him about it immediately. He was eating what he could eat. He was not distressed. I called quietly for the platform's medical officer and asked her to come to the medical bay when convenient, phrased as a routine check on a child who had been traveling for 11 days. I did not want to alarm him. The platform medical bay was small but functionally equipped. 2 examination tables, a diagnostic console of the standard Tier 4 specification, a pharmaceutical cabinet whose contents I would examine more carefully later, a supply roll, 2 tall stools, a second lower cabinet I did not initially notice. The room smelled of antiseptic and something faintly organic, which I later identified as the feed store compound she kept in the lower cabinet for the livestock work. Dara-san came in 6 minutes after I had sent the call. She was wearing work trousers and a gray thermal layer with the sleeves pushed to the elbow. She had the smell of the lower enclosures on her, not strongly, but present, the warm, earthy smell of an animal space, which in another context I might have found incongruous in a medical setting, and which in this context I found, inexplicably, reassuring. She was carrying a battered black bag that she set on the counter without ceremony. She was not what I was expecting. I am describing this plainly because it is relevant. When I called for the platform physician, I expected a certain kind of person, composed, clinical, professionally softened, the variant of medical manner that has been trained into the court physicians over years of working with royalty. Dara-san did not have any of that. She looked at me, and then she looked at Sarath with the same level, unperformed attention, as if we were both simply patients in her room, and the question of rank had not occurred to her as a relevant variable. "How long?" she said. I told her what I knew. She nodded once and went to my son. I will describe the examination in some detail because I have thought about it since and I believe it tells you something important. She examined him thoroughly. Temperature, ears, throat, eyes. She pressed carefully along his neck and beneath his jaw at the lymph points. She listened to his chest and back with a basic stethoscope from her bag, had him breathe deeply twice, and listened again. She checked his eyes for the quality of light response. She took his pulse at the wrist and held it for a full 30 seconds. All of this was done in under 10 minutes, and it was done with complete, unembellished concentration. She talked to him as she worked. Not to me, to him. Short, plain questions. Does this hurt when I press here? When you breathe deeply, does it catch or stay smooth? Is the ache in your head behind your eyes or at the front? Is it there right now or does it come and go? He answered all of them, without hesitation, without the anxiety that medical attention sometimes produces in him. I noticed this. I filed it. When she was finished, she straightened and stood with her arms folded, looking at her own temperature reading. "Velith fever," she said. "The strain that comes in on the grain shipments from the outer ring. We have had 4 cases in the livestock since I arrived, 2 calves, a breeding ewe, and one of the bird stock colonies. It presents identically in large mammals. Gradual onset, a stable first night, rapid escalation on the second, fever spikes somewhere between 32 and 36 hours post-onset, and then it breaks." She looked at me. "The spike is the dangerous part. The rest is uncomfortable but manageable." I had a number of thoughts at this moment which I will render in the order they occurred. The first was, she has seen this before, which was a relief. The second was, she has seen this before in animals, which was not a relief in the same way but which had its own logic, because animals were also large warm-blooded organisms and the platform's livestock had all recovered. The third was, she has named the dangerous part, which means she knows what the dangerous part is, which means she knows how to address it. "My court physicians," I said, 3 of them. They are currently at the Vel Rithani node staging for the tour's remaining stations. That is 8 hours by express transit," she said. "I know the distances." She looked at me with the patient, even expression of a person who has delivered information to a great many frightened owners and has learned to wait through the first response before continuing. "You are welcome to call them back. They will advise you of the same treatment I am about to begin, and they will arrive on the morning of the 3rd day, which is after the spike. You can do that or I can begin now. It is your choice." There is a version of that exchange in which I am affronted. I want you to know that version exists, because I was aware of it even as the moment was happening. Aware of the register she was using and aware that in any other context it would have required a response. But my son was lying on an examination table, and his temperature was rising, and she was the only physician in the room, and what I felt was not affront. It was clarity. She had given me accurate information and a real choice, and she was waiting for my answer. "Begin," I said. She nodded and opened her bag. The first thing she did was return to the lower cabinet and retrieve a sealed supply crate. She opened it with the ease of someone who opens it regularly and knows the exact position of every container within it. "Feed store compounds," she said, again in the tone of speaking to herself, or at least not requiring a response from me. She set containers on the counter in a deliberate order. Grain mold suppressant, high-grade, full inhibitor concentration. Cooling clay from the Veltherin agricultural processing line, the pharmaceutical-grade batch we keep for the livestock. Pressed sarin oil. She paused at a fourth container. This one is a low-concentration neurological suppressant we use for animals in acute distress. It dampens the nervous system response without sedation, reduces the thrashing behavior during high-fever episodes. She looked up at me. I have used an adapted ratio on humans twice, both in fever contexts. It is not approved for human use in any formal sense. It works. Use it, I said. She measured and combined. I watched her hands while she did this. They were not the soft, clean hands of a court physician, whose work is delicate and largely touch-based, and whose instruments are calibrated to the finest available precision. They were hands that had spent decades doing physical work in difficult conditions, larger at the knuckle, calloused at the thumb and forefinger, certain in every movement. She measured not by eye but by instrument, a small calibrated dropper for each compound. The amounts noted carefully on her pad beside the entry for Soreth's temperature and the time. She mixed the compounds in a shallow bowl. She added a binding agent from the pharmaceutical cabinet. She tested the consistency against her own palm, examined the color, adjusted one component by a small amount, tested again. Then she cut a compress from the supply roll, folded it to the correct depth, and applied the mixture evenly before pressing the compress closed. She put it on my son's chest. He made a sound startlement, I think, at the temperature of the clay, which was cool against his skin even through the fabric layer she'd asked him to keep on. She said, "I know. Give it 60 seconds," in the same tone she had used all evening, neither warming nor cooling, simply present. Within 90 seconds his breathing had changed. Not dramatically, but the high, tight quality of a chest under fever pressure had eased fractionally, and his shoulders had dropped. "The compress every 2 hours through the night," she said. "Temperature check every 40 minutes. He needs fluids, not the platform's nutrition supplement that has too much solute. Plain water with sarin grain dissolved. I'll mix the solution and give you the ratios." She paused. "You can administer it. He should take small amounts frequently rather than large amounts at intervals, every 20 minutes while he is awake." I heard the subtext. You can administer it because I need you to have something to do, and this is within your competence. I did not find this condescending. I found it accurate. "The spike," I said. "You said the second night." "Yes," she was writing in her pad. "Approximately 32 to 36 hours from first onset. It will be faster and hotter than tonight, and he will become confused. He may not know where he is. He may not know who you are." She looked up briefly. "I will be here the entire night." "He is my patient," she said, with the same mild impatience of someone answering an obvious question. "Of course." I stayed in the medical bay that night. I am aware that this was not the most efficient use of my presence. She did not need my assistance, and my presence introduced a variable she had not accounted for in the room's management. But I could not leave. Soreth was 9 years old, and he was ill, and whatever else I am his father, and a father does not go to his own cabin to sleep while his child lies sick in a room down the corridor. I sat in the chair in the corner, and I stayed out of her way, and I watched. She moved through the bay with the ease of a person who has been in many small, imperfectly stocked rooms, and has learned within 60 seconds where everything is. She organized the counter. She prepared 3 rounds of compress in advance, so she would not have to remix them at 2 in the morning. She heated the sarin grain solution in the warming unit and decanted it into a sealed flask. She calibrated the temperature instrument against the bay's own monitor, and noted the small discrepancy between them, and wrote down the correction factor. Then she sat on her stool, set her pad on the counter, and continued writing. Not charts. I looked once carefully. Notes. She was writing up the livestock cases from that afternoon, the respiratory infection in the calves she had been managing before we arrived. The work did not stop because a different patient had arrived. She was doing what needed to be done, and she was doing it in the hours available to do it. At the temperature checks, she rose from the stool, took the reading, noted it, replaced the compress if needed, and returned to the stool. She moved quietly and with an economy of motion that I associated with people who have learned to work in conditions where excess movement is costly, cold or cramped or both. She did not pause to see if I was watching. In the third hour, Sareth woke. Not gently, the kind of waking that fever produces, fractured and confused, the eyes opening into a room he didn't immediately recognize. He pulled against the bedding. He made a high sound that was not quite a word. She was at the bedside before I had fully registered what was happening. She did not speak immediately. She made a sound instead, low, resonant, not quite melodic, almost subvocal, the kind of sound that you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. I have since asked the platform staff about this sound, and they have confirmed that she uses it in the livestock enclosures when an animal is acutely distressed and needs to be managed without restraint. They said she had used it on the calves during their illness, and that it worked faster than any of them had expected. Standing in the corner of the medical bay at 3 in the morning, I could only observe that Sareth heard it and went still. Not sedated, alert, his eyes open, tracking her face, but still. The panic had stopped. Something in the sound had located him. She spoke then plainly. "You are on the platform. Your name is Sareth. You have a fever and I am managing it. Your father is in the corner." He turned his head toward the corner. He looked at me. I was aware that my face was probably not as composed as I would have wished. He looked at me for a moment and then back at her. "Am I going to be sick for long?" he said. "2 more nights," she said. "Tomorrow will be harder. After that it gets easier." "Does it hurt?" "Not as much as it did for the calves," she said, "and they are all fine now." He considered this. "Okay," he said, and lay back. She put her hands on him then, flat against his back and chest, not gripping, not constraining, but with a pressure that was steady and even and that I can only describe as informing. The pressure said, "You are here, these are your edges, you are contained, you are not alone." She held this for some minutes, her weight slightly forward, her breathing audible in the silence of the bay, slow, deliberate, the kind of breathing a person does when they are setting the pace for another person's breathing to follow. Within 5 minutes his was matching hers. Within 7 he was asleep. She did not move until she was certain. Then she went back to her stool and wrote down the time and what had happened, and returned to her notes about the calves. I was watching. I was watching because I had nothing else to do, and because I could not sleep, and because I was in the presence of something I could not entirely account for and wanted, instinctively, to keep watching until I could. "Where did you learn that?" I said. My voice was quieter than I intended. "The hold." She looked up from her pad. She considered the question for a moment, long enough that I could see her evaluating whether I was asking to be polite or asking, because I actually wanted to know. She apparently decided on the latter. "Large animal work," she said. "A horse in serious pain will try to run because the nervous system defaults to flight in a crisis. You cannot run in a pen. The pen is not a safe structure to run in. The horse knows this and runs anyway because the pain is louder than the knowledge. If you restrain them, they escalate. They read restraint as another threat, another thing to run from." She was not reading from anywhere. This was simply what she knew, and she was telling it. You match them instead. You put your weight against their flank and their back at specific pressure points, and you breathe slowly, and you make the sound, and you wait. The nervous system receives. I am bounded, something is here, something is not moving. It stops receiving. Run. And then you have maybe a minute to do whatever it is you need to do before the horse decides the danger has passed and relaxes on its own. "And it works," I said. "Yes," she turned back to her notes. "The neurology is not so different between large mammals. The fear response is not species-specific. It is old, older than species." I thought about this for a long time. "I have a pediatric physician," I said. "Veldoreth trained, 11 years with the royal household. I have 3 court nurses. None of them have gotten him to sleep that quickly when he was frightened. She looked up at me. The expression she gave me was not pride and not false modesty and not the calculating awareness of how to receive a compliment from a king. It was simply, yes, well. They learned methods designed for children, she said. Human children. My methods were designed for animals that cannot tell you what they feel and cannot be reasoned with and cannot be promised it will be better soon. She paused. Sometimes that is the better fit. The second day Sarath was stable, intermittently himself and bored. He had the particular quality of boredom that only children have, an active, contained boredom that announces itself through small, persistent motion, and the need to engage with every passing person as if they were a resource. Dara-san came to check his readings twice in the morning and once in the early afternoon, and each time he redirected her into conversation with the efficient determination of someone who has assessed the available company and concluded that she is the most interesting person in the room. She answered him plainly, without performing patience. When he asked about the calves, she told him what they had, how she was treating it, and what the prognosis was. When he asked why calves got the same fever as him, she explained, in terms that were accurate but not simplified into condescension, that the Velith fever pathogen was an opportunistic organism that inhabited the grain shipments and took advantage of any warm-blooded respiratory system that came into contact with it without prior exposure. When he asked whether the pathogen could think, she said no. A pathogen does not think. It simply does what it is built to do in conditions that favor it. Like a plant, he said. She looked at him. Yes, she said, like a plant, it grows where it can grow. That's not evil, he said, it's just alive. She looked at him for another moment, in the particular way she had of looking at things that had just said something that required registering. No, she said, it is just alive. You are right. He nodded, satisfied. Then, can I see the grain today? She took his temperature. She checked his color and his eyes. Tomorrow, she said, if the afternoon reading is where the morning one is. That is fair, he said, and picked up the grain varieties catalog that the station manager had brought him, which he had apparently been reading with genuine interest since morning. She did not look at me on the way out, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way that I had begun to recognize as the closest she came to an unreserved smile. The afternoon reading held. The third afternoon reading, taken at the 6-hour interval she had established, was within the acceptable range. She came in, noted it on the chart, added it to the pattern she had been tracking since the first day, and said, "Observation deck, 40 minutes, warm layer." He was ready before she finished the sentence. I want to tell you about that 40 minutes because it was, in retrospect, the point at which I began to understand something I had not understood before. The observation deck of Outpost Velithkale is not an impressive space. It is a rectangular room with a wide viewport on the outer ring side and a bench along the inner wall, designed to give the platform staff a view of the orbital fields during their off hours. The agricultural beds are visible from it, the long terraced rows of the outer ring grain varieties, planted in sections by maturation stage, so that some portion of the beds is always harvest-ready. From the viewport, it looked like a shelf of green, lit by the station's full-spectrum lamps, and by the pale distant light that filters through from the outer system, cold and clear and very still. Sarath pressed his face against the viewport within 5 seconds of entering the room. He was quiet for a long time. I stood beside him. Dara-san sat on the bench with her pad open on her knee, writing, not looking at the grain. She had her own view of it, presumably, built from 27 years of platforms like this one and months on this one specifically, and she did not need the viewport the way a 9-year-old seeing it for the first time needed the viewport. "It is taller than I thought," he said eventually. "Outer ring variety," she said without looking up. "Longer growing season. The stalks have more time to develop." "Why does it need a longer growing season?" "The outer ring light is weaker and colder than the inner ring platforms. A grain that grew at the same rate as an entering variety would not have time to fully develop before the conditions changed and the growing cycle ended. So over many generations of selection, the outering strains grew slower. They use what light they have more efficiently, and they don't rush. Sareth was still looking at the grain. Someone chose that, which one survived. Yes, agricultural selection over about 200 years of outering farming, though chose is approximate. The ones that grew slowly and efficiently had more viable seed. The ones that didn't had less. Over enough generations, the platform is growing the descendants of the ones that worked. He turned this over. So the grain is that way because the hard ones survived. Yes. He was quiet again. Then, that's what you said. Hardy means it grew up in difficult conditions. Yes. And now that's what it is. The grain is what it had to be. She looked up from her pad at that. She looked at him for a moment in the way she had, direct, unhurried, without the mild indulgence that most adults bring to a 9-year-old's philosophical speculations. She was simply receiving what he had said and considering whether it was accurate. Yes, she said, that is a precise way to describe it. He nodded, satisfied in the particular way he has when he has said something that has been confirmed rather than merely praised. He turned back to the viewport. He stayed at the glass for the remaining 25 minutes, watching the grain in the station light, and he did not ask any more questions, and the room was quiet, and it was one of the better 40 minutes I have spent in recent memory. I found her in the lower enclosures that afternoon. Not deliberately. I went down there because I had nowhere useful to be, and the enclosures were the part of the platform I had not yet seen, and I am a man who finds that physical movement through a space steadies his thinking in ways that sitting still does not. She was in the calf pen, crouched beside one of the sick animals with a diagnostic instrument in her hand, and a notepad open on the floor beside her. The pen smelled strongly of grain dust and the particular warm, damp smell of animal spaces. She did not look up when I came in. "How are they?" I said. "Better," she said. "They have the fever, but they are through the spike. The worst of the two is eating again, which is a reliable indicator." She made a note. "Sareth will be eating again by morning of the 4th day. The pattern is consistent." I stood at the fence rail and watched her work. The sick calf watched me from the far corner of the pen, with the large, liquid, deeply suspicious eyes that cattle have when a human they do not know enters their space. "You have done this a long time," I said. 27 years, she said. She was pressing gently along the calf's ribs, checking for a response she was looking for. "I worked the Vel Theron agricultural ring for the first 12 years, then I moved to contract work, platforms like this one, outering postings." She made another note. "I prefer them. The isolation." She looked up at that briefly. "The clarity," she said. "On a platform like this, the problem in front of you is the problem. There is not another problem underneath it or beside it or arriving from a different direction. There is the sick animal and the available treatment and the outcome." She returned to the calf. "I am good at that kind of problem." The second night came faster than she had predicted. 32 hours she had estimated. It was 30. The temperature began climbing at the 10th hour of the second night, and it did not climb the way it had on the first night, gradually, with warning, with space to prepare. It climbed quickly. Within 90 minutes, Sareth's temperature had moved from manageable into the range she had marked on her chart as the spike threshold, and then past it. She had been in the bay since the 8th hour. She had read the trajectory in the afternoon readings and had said nothing to me except, "I am going to stay tonight," and had set up her materials with the brisk, contained efficiency of a person who has assessed what is coming and decided to meet it with preparation rather than alarm. Extra compresses, pre-mixed and sealed. The sarin grain solution heated and ready. The neurological compound measured and drawn into an administration syringe that she set on the counter with the same matter-of-fact placement she used for everything. "This goes here. This goes here. Everything in reach, nothing wasted." Sareth became delirious at the peak of the spike. I am going to describe this plainly because it is in the record and you need to know what happened, but I am going to describe it briefly because it is also the part of this account that I most wanted to leave out. He did not know where he was. He did not know who I was. He called for his mother. His mother, historian, has been dead since he was 4 years old. Her name was Sareth Thorne, and she died of a cardiac insufficiency that the court physicians did not detect in time, and I have not fully made my peace with that in the 5 years since, and I do not expect to. He called for her in the thin, certain voice of a child who expects to be answered. I could not answer. Dara-san was at the bedside, as she had been at the beginning of the spike, and she did not look at me when this happened, which I found later to have been a form of mercy. She made the sound the low, subvocal hum, and she put her hands on him, and she spoke to him. She used his name and told him where he was. She told him the fever was the reason he was confused and that the confusion would not last. She did not tell him his mother was coming. She did not tell him anything that was not true. She stayed at that bedside for 6 hours. I know this because I stayed as well. I sat in my chair in the corner and I watched her work through the night with the steady, unhurried competence of someone who has done difficult things in bad conditions many times and has learned that panic does not help, and that what helps is the next action, and then the next one after that. She checked his temperature. She refreshed the compress. She administered the soaring grain solution in small, careful amounts. When he surfaced from the confusion, she was there with her voice and her hands and the sound, and each time it worked, and each time he subsided back into a manageable stillness. At the 4th hour, she called across the room to me. "There is sarin broth in the warming unit. If you heat it to medium and bring it here." I went to the warming unit and heated the broth to medium and brought it across the room. She took it without looking up. She was watching Sareth's face, monitoring something in his response to the latest compress that she did not interrupt to explain. She tilted his head with one hand and administered the broth in careful small sips, watching his throat. He took perhaps a third of the cup. She set it down and returned her attention to the compound. I stood beside the table. I did not sit down. I had been sitting for 4 hours and I needed to be upright, and I needed, I think, to be closer to him than the corner chair allowed. "What do I do?" I said. It came out of me before I had decided to say it. It was not a formal question. It was not a king asking a contractor for a protocol recommendation. It was simply a man who had been sitting in a corner for 4 hours watching something terrible and had run out of the composure necessary to maintain silence. She looked up. She looked at me directly, without the complex social calculation that most people perform when I say something unexpectedly unguarded. Just, "There is a person in front of me. Let me understand what they need." "Sit on this side," she said, "so he can see your face when he surfaces. Hold his hand. Talk normally, not about being sick and not about being afraid, about ordinary things, the grain. What you saw on the observation deck, the calves getting better." She paused. "He will hear it even when he doesn't respond." I sat on the edge of the examination table on the other side. I took my son's hand in both of mine. I talked. I talked about the observation deck and the grain and the outer ring variety, and how it learns to be hardy in difficult conditions, and how it wakes up and feels normal again. I talked about the calves and how they were through the worst of it and eating. I talked for a long time about things that did not matter and that mattered entirely, because he was listening, somewhere inside the fever, and I wanted him to hear something other than confusion. Dara-san sat on her side and did what she had been doing all night. I became aware of her at some point as a quality in the room rather than simply a person in the room. I do not know how else to describe it. The steadiness was coming from her, not performed steadiness, not the careful professional calm that court staff apply over their real states, but a steadiness that was simply there, the way a wall is simply there, emanating nothing, requiring nothing, solid. Sareth received it through her hands. I received it through the fact of her presence. I do not think she knew she was giving it. The fever broke at 5:30 in the morning. There was no dramatic moment. She took his temperature, noted the reading, took it again 90 seconds later, noted it again. Then she sat back on her stool and was still for a moment, not quite the stillness of rest and not quite anything else, the stillness of a person absorbing a fact. "Breaking," she said. I looked at Sarath. His color had changed. The fever pallor, the yellow-gray cast that illness puts on skin, was receding. The clenched quality around his eyes had smoothed. His breathing was different, slower, more even, the breathing of a person whose body has stopped fighting and started recovering. He was asleep in the genuine way, not the restless, half-present fever sleep of the previous hours. He was simply asleep. Dara-san set down her pad and leaned her elbows on the counter and rested her face in her hands for approximately 30 seconds. She made no sound. It was not distress. It was the simple, physical release of a person who has held a great deal of tension through a long and difficult shift and is now, briefly, setting it down before picking up the next task. 30 seconds. Then she picked up her pad and wrote the final morning readings in the correct columns. 2 more days on the platform before transit, she said. The fever will continue to drop, but his system needs to complete the recovery before he is moved. Fluids, rest, no exertion. She was capping her pen. The compress can stop. He doesn't need it. I looked at my son's face. He was asleep the way children are asleep when they are finally and genuinely safe. The face smooth and open, the hands unclenched, the breathing so steady you want to measure it against something just to confirm it is real. I had not seen his face look like that in 3 days. "Dara," I said. She looked up. "I've given people things before, historian. Honors and appointments and letters of commendation and the formal words that go with recognition in this court. I know how to do it. I know the language and the forms, and I know how to deliver them in a way that carries the appropriate weight. I opened my mouth to begin, and I found that I had no language. Not the formal language, I had plenty of that. The right language. The language that fit what had happened in the previous 30 hours between this woman and my son, and this room. What I said was, 'Thank you.'" She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. Not the court nod, not the small, carefully calibrated acknowledgement that carries in it the whole architecture of hierarchy. Just, "I heard you." The nod of one person receiving a genuine statement from another person. "He is a good patient," she said. "Stayed still when I needed him to, answered my questions accurately. Some of them don't." She was gathering her bag. "I'll print the full assessment for your physicians when they arrive. They will want the compound ratios. If the fever recurs, which it sometimes does once lighter, they will know how to manage it." Then she left to sleep. I stayed in the chair beside the examination table and watched my son breathe, and found that I had nothing to do with my hands or my mind except sit and be present for the fact of him being alive, which was, I think, exactly the right use of the morning. The physicians arrived that afternoon. 3 of them, senior court medical staff, travel-worn and visibly distressed at what they had been unable to prevent by their absence. They were professional about it. They read Dara-san's notes in full, examined Sarath, conducted their own assessment, and found no material discrepancy. I want to give Keth Vel Arin his due in this account. He is a man of genuine ability and considerable professional pride, and the combination of those 2 things can produce a kind of defensive rigidity in people when they encounter evidence of having been superseded. He did not produce that rigidity. He read her notes carefully. I watched him read them, which he did twice, which is the thing he does when he is making sure he has understood something accurately rather than assuming he has. And then he examined my son with thoroughness and without haste, and afterward he came to me with the careful expression of a man who has something to say and is going to say it correctly. "The treatment protocol she followed was correct," he said. "The compound ratios for the compress are unorthodox. I would have reached for different compounds in a different order, but they were within biological tolerance and they worked effectively." He paused. "The sleep induction method, the sound and the pressure application. I was not familiar with it. I asked her about it and she described the origin and the mechanism. And I said, "It is a livestock management technique adapted for application to a human patient," he said. He had the expression of a man deciding in real time whether to be affronted by this and concluding that the outcome data did not support affront. The neurology is, as she stated, consistent across large mammals. The technique works. He looked at me directly. In my professional opinion, with the physicians available at the Vel-Rithani node and the transit time at 8 hours, the outcome here could not have been materially better had we been present. This was not easy for him to say. I understood that and I appreciated it. I have asked her to document the method formally, he continued. The compound ratios and the induction technique both. I intend to bring the documentation to the court medical division for review, with your permission. You have my permission, I said, and my encouragement. He nodded and returned to Sorath, whose temperature he proceeded to check with the calibrated equipment he had brought from the palace and whose readings he compared, line by line, against Dar-Rassan's chart. The comparison held. Let them take over Sorath's management for the remaining 2 days. That was correct. They were the right people for the ongoing care, which was now routine, monitoring and recovery rather than the acute work of the crisis. Dar-Rassan was not needed in the bay anymore. She went back to the calves. I found this out from the station manager, who mentioned it in passing while briefing me on the tour's adjusted schedule. The veterinarian was back in the lower enclosures working the respiratory cases. The calves were responding. She had also begun the final documentation for the grain variety survey she had been conducting in parallel with her medical duties, which she expected to complete before the end of her contract term. She was, in the station manager's words, getting on with it. I thought about this for some time. I thought about what it meant that she was getting on with it, and what it meant that this was her natural state, the return to the regular work, the completion of the outstanding tasks, the absence of any expectation that the situation she had managed would translate into anything other than the memory of having done a difficult thing well. On the morning of our departure, I asked the station manager to have Dar-Rassan meet me at the dock entrance. She came exactly on time. She was in the same gray thermal layer and work trousers. Her bag was over one shoulder. She had come from the enclosures. The faint warm animal smell was present, and her hands had the particular cleanliness of hands that have been recently scrubbed of something, the skin slightly reddened at the knuckle. She stood at the dock entrance with the settled, at ease posture of someone who is where they are supposed to be and is comfortable with that fact. Sorath was beside me. He had been told we were leaving and had insisted on coming to the dock to say goodbye, and had stood at my side with the solemn, slightly formal bearing that he sometimes adopts when he understands that something important is happening and he wants to behave appropriately for it. When he saw her, he said, "The smaller calf is better," with the confidence of someone reporting confirmed intelligence. "Yes," she said, "both of them are. The worse one ate this morning." "That is the indicator," he said seriously. "It is." He nodded, satisfied, and settled into stillness beside me. I had prepared what I intended to say. I had prepared it across the 2 remaining days, which is more preparation than I typically give to unscripted conversation, because I was aware that I had one opportunity and that it mattered. "I would like to offer you a permanent appointment with the court," I said. "Position to be determined at your preference, senior consultant to the court medical division, senior lecturer at the Vel-Dorath Academy, director of a Tier 4 platform of your choosing, based at the palace, full resources of the court at your disposal." She listened to this. She had the same level, patient expression she brought to information, receiving it without performance, processing it without hurry. "That is generous," she said. "It is considerably less than what you did," I said. She tilted her head slightly. "With respect," she said, "I did my job. You kept my son alive. Yes, that is the job. She shifted her bag. I appreciate the offer, I mean that. But I have 17 animals in the lower enclosures, and 2 of them have a respiratory infection I have not fully characterized yet, and I am 3 weeks into a 6-month survey of Tier 4 livestock ailments that I intend to complete. And she glanced past me, toward the viewport at the far end of the dock that looked out over the orbital field, the long terraced rows of outer ring grain in the light. I like it here. It is quiet. The work is clear. I know what I am supposed to be doing when I wake up in the morning. You could have clarity at court, I said. I don't think court is quiet in the relevant sense, she said pleasantly, and I think the problems there would be less clear, multiple layers. She met my eyes. I am good at the kind of problem that has one layer. I looked at her for a moment. She was right, and she knew she was right, and there was no evasion in it and no false modesty and no calculated performance of the humble professional declining the king's offer. She was a person who knew precisely what conditions she needed to function well, and she was declining an offer that would have removed those conditions. It was, in the final analysis, the same competence she had shown in the medical bay, the same clear-eyed assessment of what was in front of her. My son will ask about you, I said. Tell him the compound that worked on the calves was the same compound that worked on him. He will find that satisfying. The corner of her mouth moved. He will, I said, and because plain language was what the situation deserved and had deserved from the beginning, I don't know how to account for what you did, adequately. She thought about this. You don't need to account for it, she said. He is well, that is the whole account. Then she put out her hand. Palm inward, fingers together, the working handshake of the outer ring crews and the dock workers and the agricultural contractors. I took it. I shook it. Her grip was what I expected, certain, not performative, present. Safe transit, Your Majesty, she said. Safe work, I said. The correct reply. Some briefing, somewhere in the accumulated years of outer ring preparation had given me this, and it arrived without effort, and I was glad of it. She nodded once and turned back toward the enclosures. Sareth watched her go. He was quiet for a moment. She is going back to the calves, he said. Yes, I said. He considered this. Good, he said. They still need her. We boarded the transit. I sat across from my son for the 8 hours back and watched him eat his lunch and sleep and wake and press his face against the viewport to watch the platforms recede behind us. He was entirely alive. He was wearing a gray thermal layer that Velith Kale's textile store had produced when his own was ruined on the first night of the illness. It was slightly large on him at the shoulders. He had refused to change into anything else when we offered it. He had the grain varieties catalog from the station manager in his bag. I know this because I watched him put it there before we boarded. He did not mention it. I did not mention it. He will read it when he wants to read it and will not perform interest in it for my benefit. He is, in this respect and in many others, his own person. That is the account. I have given it to you as completely and accurately as I am able. You asked me at the beginning of this session whether there were aspects of the situation I would have handled differently. I said I would answer that at the end. The answer is no. I would not have arranged for different physicians to be posted on Velith Kale. I would not have arranged for us to avoid the platform or for the timing to be different. I am glad it happened as it happened, with the people it happened with, in the small medical bay on an outer ring platform that grows grain and monitors livestock and has 11 staff members and is not, in any formal sense, a royal destination. I am glad my son was sick for 3 nights and was kept alive by a woman who fixes sick animals, because when he woke up on the 4th morning he asked to see the grain, and when he is a king, he will know that the person who learned the technique that kept him breathing learned it in a livestock pen from animals that could not tell her what they felt. He will not, I think, have any difficulty understanding what that is worth. Record that exactly as I said it. There is one further item which is not for the formal account. You may note it separately or not at all. I leave that to your judgment. When I returned to the palace, I authorized a review of the medical supply allocation for all Tier 4 platforms in the Vel-Thorn Outer Ring. The review recommended, and I approved, an upgrade to the pharmaceutical stock, updated diagnostic equipment in each medical bay, and a direct emergency transit line from each Tier 4 station to the nearest hub to reduce the response time in medical emergencies from 8 hours to 3. The measure passed through the Administrative Council as a routine infrastructure item. It was not marked as urgent and attracted no particular notice. I also asked the Palace Pharmaceutical Division to assess the compound ratios used in the compressed treatment for Velith fever. The assessment concluded that the ratios were effective, that the cooling clay and sarin oil combination was more bioavailable than the existing court protocol compound, and that the neurological suppressant ratio was within safe parameters for human application. The combination is now listed in the court medical guidelines as the standard treatment protocol for Velith fever presentations. It is listed without attribution, as is standard for adopted clinical treatments. She does not know this. She will not unless she reads the court medical guidelines, which I think is unlikely given her opinion of court in general. I did not write to tell her. She would not, I think, particularly want to know. She was doing her job. I wanted you to know it anyway. That is everything. Thank you for your time, historian. I will see you next month for the regular session. We are done here.